Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to the third panel this afternoon. And first good news, the last panel before lunchtime. My name is Julian Rocca. I'm responsible political editor at Bild newspaper, which is Germany's largest newspaper or tabloid. And before I want to make some introductory remarks on the situation so everyone knows what we're talking about. I would like to introduce our panel. To my right is Mr. Brian Whitmore, longtime Kremlin watcher and blogger on Central and Eastern European affairs, and of course senior fellow and director of the Russia program at the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPAR. Right to him, we see Ms. Anna Wieslander, Director for Northern Europe at the Atlantic Council and chair of the Stockholm-based Institute for Security and Development Policies. And to her right, we see Professor Simon Serfaty, who was the first holder of the Zbigniew Brzezinski Chair in Global Security and Geopolitics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and still is professor and eminent scholar at the Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. Ladies and gentlemen, are these strange times in which we are living? New powers shaping regions or shaping history is the question of this panel. And just yesterday, I had a little experience which brought up the actuality of this topic to me. I was taking part in a Berlin conference of the Free Russia Foundation, and during the lunch break, I had the lucky situation that I was seated next to a security and defense diplomat from a country not far away from Latvia, who I was talking to. And he said to me, you know, I'm really afraid of the next NATO summit in December in London. And I asked him, why are you afraid? And he said, I see a real threat of Donald Trump stepping out of this summit after he contacted all the other leaders, after they had the discussions, going to the media and saying, I have decided that the United States will leave NATO because Germany is not paying enough and they didn't help us in the Second World War. And he was not laughing, because what he was referring to was, of course, Donald Trump saying exactly this 2 days ago about the Kurdish militia and the Kurds in northern Syria, that he said, we are not feeling obliged to help them anymore, and we are not feeling obliged to put our money into this endless war, as he calls it, because the Kurds didn't help us in the Second World War and they didn't help us in the Normandy, which is, by the way, not true. Kurdish units were helping the Allied forces in Iraq and Syria between 1941 and 1944. But still, I mean, the question is, how did we get to this point? How did we get to a point where NATO members, where representatives of NATO countries are more afraid of the actions of a president of the most important NATO country than they are of possibly Islamist terrorists, which until very shortly ago controlled the area of the size of Belgium in Syria and Iraq? Or they are more afraid than of rising powers, like the ones we are talking about today, which challenge NATO in many areas and in many subjects. And the answer to this question, how did we come to this point that we have a person there being so strong, being so influential, and making people so afraid of, was also published some days ago in the report of the Select Committee on Intelligence of the United States Senate on Russian active measures, campaigns, and interference in the 2016 election. It reads in the main findings, first paragraph, the committee found that the IRA, the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, sought to influence the 2016 US presidential elections by harming Hillary Clinton's chances of success and supporting Donald Trump at the direction of the Kremlin. While I'm not saying that Mr. Trump wouldn't have won this election without any Kremlin help, there seems to be consensus, not only in the United States intelligence community, but also in the Republican-run Senate, that at least they tried to help him. So this, I think, is one first point where almost no one can disagree that someone was shaping not only a region but history. But ever since, what happened? I'm from Germany, and I remember that a year later, in 2017, everyone was afraid, like, what will the Kremlin do? How will they influence the German elections? And I can promise you, we were digging. We were really digging for Kremlin influence operations. And we found some. We found, for example, that they used the Russian state TV to influence the Russian minority in Germany by saying, vote for AfD, the right-wing party. We found some others. That they were on the day of election saying the Wahlbetrug, election fraud. So, and this was spread by Kremlin-led trolls, which were otherwise spreading porn or instigating against Mr. Navalny. So this is hard evidence. But altogether, come on, this was not really something was not the thing we were afraid of. Just a week ago, Austria voted. I haven't seen a single report of the Kremlin getting involved in this election and trying to support the FPÖ, for example, or trying to weaken the chancellor. So the question is this all over? Was this just a unique thing happening? Did the Kremlin maybe overplay its card and saw that the chaos it caused in the aftermath of the election was even too much for it? Because, as you know, there's a backslash. So there's Senate going against the president, going against Russia, and so on. Or even did Russia change to a more Chinese approach, so being more the nice guy who is just economically influencing wherever he can or she can, and not openly, aggressively against another country? Well, I think these questions can hopefully be answered by our panel here. And the first question I would like to ask is to Brian. Because I've seen your last CEPA presentations, your last CEPA videos, and it's while you are while you're in the Russia program, it was dealing with, is there a possible annexation of Belarus in the next months? It was dealing with the Steinmeier formula. So how does the Kremlin and how does maybe also Germany influence Eastern Ukraine and the occupied areas? So my question is this any indication that we are coming back from global to regional matters when it comes to Russia?
Thank you, Julian. And the short answer to your question is no. The more complicated answer to your question is that we really can't separate these global and regional matters. I wanted to briefly just go back to your remarks about whether Russia was backing off on election interference, because I don't think this is the case. We always tend to fight the last war. And you say there was no interference or marginal interference in Germany. I would say that the AfD had their best result to date in Germany, and the AfD is and that certainly could be measured as success, right? Measuring success in these operations are different, but I think what's happening is that the virus is mutating, if you will, because we're not just talking about election interference. Election interference is one tool in a whole toolkit of malign influence operations that the Kremlin uses in Western Europe and in North America. There was an article in the New York Times this week about a special unit of the GRU that is operating in Europe in order to undermine European institutions. So I would say they're certainly not backing off. To your more pressing question, I don't think you can separate the global from the regional in this sense. And yes, my last two pieces of work looked at Ukraine and Belarus, but tomorrow I could be looking at the Baltic states, and the next day I could be looking at Georgia. What do all these countries have in common? Well, they happen to be Russia's neighbors. The way we need to look at this conflict we're in with Russia right now is we have to look at it in a holistic way and a systemic way. This is a systemic conflict we're in. This is not a problem with Putin. This is not a problem because we were not nice enough to Putin in the 90s. And if we were just nicer to him, Russia would behave itself. This is a systemic conflict between two incompatible systems. One in the West that's based on institutions, the rule of law, the rights of the individual, accountability, transparency, the sanctity of contracts. We don't always live up to these ideals, but we aspire to live up to these ideals. And one to the East that doesn't even pretend to aspire to live up to those ideals. It's based on patron-client relationships, networks of influence, corruption, arbitrary rule. These two systems are incompatible with each other. So in one sense, we're in a situation very similar to the Cold War, where we have two normative systems facing off against each other. But what's different from the Cold War is that in the Cold War, they were hermetically sealed, right? And the main threat was one of military aggression from the east to the west, right? This time, they're not hermetically sealed. They're integrated together with each other. We naively assumed that the age of globalization would lead to liberal values spreading. And they have, to a degree. But the other thing that's happened is certain values from the former Soviet system have spread west at the same time. Russia has weaponized corruption to create networks of influence within our own countries. They've weaponized energy. Nord Stream 2 isn't just going to pump gas into Europe, it's going to pump corruption into Europe. We have the weaponization of Russian organized crime in the West. And all of these things are designed to undermine Western democratic institutions. So this is, at one level, this is a battle of governance between two incompatible systems. But it's also a battle over the nature of the international system, because Russia wants to turn the system away from the rules-based system that has existed since the end of the Cold War, and in the Western world since the end of the Second World War, into one that's based on a more 19th century model of spheres of influence. So we'll move away from the rule of law and move into a system where might makes right. So we have basically two systems, one that plays by the rules, one that plays with the rules. And that's the essence of the problem we're in right now. I have prescriptions of how I think we should deal with this, but I'll save that for later follow-ups if you want.
Mm-hmm. Well, when you're saying it is like the Cold War, but now we don't have a wall between us. We don't have an iron curtain between us. Does this mean that? I mean, is this really the case in an area where we have more digital tools, where we have more traffic between the people, and where we also have another mindset? I mean, a totally different mindset. You said it's Soviet but different, but isn't there another mindset right now in Russia as well as in Europe? Why these two systems, as you say, are sort of competing with each other?
Well, they're competing with each other while they're integrated with each other. And that is something we have to kind of come to grips with. During the Cold War, it was very easy because, as you said, there was an iron curtain and a wall between us. In this system, we're integrated, and yes, the West can influence attitudes on the other side as well, but it is not changing the system. The system, I would argue, the system that exists in Russia, which they call systema, the term coined by the emigre political scientist Elena Litvinova, which has, I would argue, endured since the Grand Duchy of Muscovy. Right? I was recently reading The Muscovite Political Folkways by Edward Keenan. It's a brilliant monograph about court politics in medieval Muscovy. And the thing that struck me is it's exactly the same as now. I could be reading about Putin's inner circle. Right? And so this is something that has endured for a long time. We made the mistake at the end of the Cold War to think that globalization was going to just sweep this away and put Western-style institutions in place. It hasn't happened. So I think this is what we have to come to grips with. In order to come to grips with it, we need to, first of all, do reform at home. I call it resilience through reform. Because since the end of the Cold War, we have deregulated our economies to the point now where we have gaping security holes in them. And this isn't about left and right or a political argument. It's a national security argument. Mm-hmm. We have allowed black Russian cash into our system, and believe me, the black Russian cash is the new red menace. Right? And we have to be aware of that. We've deregulated our economies to the point where we are in danger. We have to do something about money laundering. We have to do something about offshore. Putin didn't invent all of these things, and I very much appreciated the Latvian Prime Minister's comments in his opening remarks comparing combating money laundering to fighting cockroaches in an apartment. You can't just do it in one apartment. This has to be a transatlantic effort, and it has to be an all-of-government effort.
Yeah.
So.
But one more question before we go to the next panelist. I mean, you're not doing these reports on Belarus and Ukraine in 2019 for nothing. Russia is doing something there.
Yes.
So how does this correspond with this systemic conflict which you were just describing, when we still have activities of Russia like we have seen in the 70s and 80s in that direct geographical sphere of interest?
Well, they're going to start where they're closest to home. Look, every Russian imperial project begins with Ukraine, but no Russian imperial project ends with Ukraine. So I'll put it that way. Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia are the key, the West Berlins and the West Germanys of our time, in my opinion. because these are the three countries that are kind of in between these two normative systems that are struggling. So we have a hot war in Ukraine, we have 20% of Georgian territory occupied, and we have a chunk of Moldovan territory occupied. So we have a kinetic aspect to this going on Russia's borders, but there's also a non-kinetic aspect, because you have the Russian sistema and the Western kind of institution-based system fighting with each other within these countries. So there's a war of governance on Russia's periphery, and there's a hot war on Russia's periphery, and we have to pay attention to it and look at it in this systemic fashion. So I would not separate the two. Every Russian imperial project begins with Ukraine, continues along the periphery of Russia, but doesn't end there. It moves farther to the west, and that's what we have to be conscious of right now.
Thank you. Professor Serfaty, in 2017 you were at a panel just like this, but for the European Union. And you were making three major points about how the whole global power system is structured right now. And these were about China, Russia, and the Euro-Transatlantic circumstances. So first you said, China is a mega power, is a superpower, but only in Asia. Because in the rest of the world, no one is voluntarily taking up the system and wants to have the system. They want to have trade with China, but they don't want to be like China. The second one, you said Russia will look to the West after these struggles are over from 2014 and 2015, especially with Ukraine, because you said they have no other chance. There's no other direction where they could look. And the third most interesting, I think, is that you said that the EU-US strategic partnership will prevail no matter what, because this is such a strong bond that not even certain presidents can weaken them. Now we are 2 years later. We are seeing China, which is, as it seems to me, getting stronger and stronger, and also telling the world, don't meddle into our affairs, which are our affairs, like Hong Kong. We have a not really better relationship between the US and EU, and Russia is, well, where it was, but not in the West. So would you still stick to these 3 points?
I'm glad you remember what I said a number of years ago. I'm not quite sure I do. But even if I were to remember, I would be quite comfortable with those conclusions. This session and the totality of this meeting is not about Russia. There's more to Russia than Putin. And it is not about Trump. There's a hell of a lot more to America than Trump. And there's more to the world than either Russia or America. This panel is about whether the new or renewed influentials are in a position to change their regions and even history. And my short, plain two-word answer to those questions, which is compatible with the way you quoted me, is not yet. And if you follow up with the question, if not yet, when, I would still answer with a plain, too short statement, who knows? It's unclear. And I do that long answer, and that will not take too much time, because you know you're going to discipline me better than I could. That relates to 3 fundamental ideas. One, beware of trends. They're not conclusive. Second, don't rush to war. They're not productive. And third, don't just insist on anticipating what the future will be. That is not constructive. Don't take a time out. Let me, if I may, develop each one of those fundamental ideas. the redistribution of power, the emergence of a so-called multipolarity, all of that kind of stuff which we hear in the academic literature and we've been reading over the past years. We know that an ascending power faces a major test, which is a test of sustainability. And that test includes several difficult parts. It's one half about resources, one half about effectiveness, competence, and the third half about time and luck. And we haven't gotten to that point yet. Similarly, declining powers faces a major test, which is the test of reversibility. And that too has several dimensions. One half about resources, one half about interests, the third half about, well, resilience. Forgive my math. And if you think back of the recent past, Japan, which was going to be the major superpower just 30 years ago, has become, in fact, the worst loser of the post-Cold War years. Brazil, up on top, 8-10 years ago. Where's Brazil now? I don't see it. Turkey, watch Turkey. Not taking its time to build up its capabilities in order to achieve its objectives. And look at the declining powers as well, facing that same test, but in the opposite direction. The US, the EU, yes. They are facing the US an unprecedented constitutional crisis, not seen in 150 years. And the EU is facing an institutional crisis, arguably not seen since the Rome treaties because of its completeness. Both crises existential, but they have the ability to turn this thing around. And when, therefore, I draw my conclusions about beware of trends, I say, look, Russia is short of capabilities, short of people, short of security space, short of time. China is pressured by time, bottom-up, people who want gratification. Economically, because somehow it cannot sustain its double-digit growth. Militarily, because it lives in one of the worst geopolitical landscapes in the world. I don't draw conclusions. I still stand by my statement about Russia running out of time and China needing another 30 good years, which are not looking good on the horizon. And I do believe in the ability on the part of the United States to renew itself indefinitely, not only in terms of capabilities, but in terms of leadership. And I do believe that because there is no plan B relative to the European Union, that the European Union, as shown by Brexit, is indeed not dead yet, too early to tell. You cited Trump. As I said earlier, there is more to America than Trump, and there is much less to Trump than America. And you are a bit too early to draw your conclusion. Wait for the next election. Then, indeed, a second term would be potentially catastrophic because the November 2020 elections are more significant than even the Truman 1948 elections, relative to both the idea of the United States and the idea of a rules-based world order. If I can take a couple of more minutes, then there is, given the fact that I still try to keep a distance from trends, keep a distance from the moment until it becomes an era, then I say, wait, but do we have the time to wait? Do we have the time to wait? There's an urgency in the air. All of those who refused to raise their hands when asked whether the Baltic region would be more unstable a few years from now were in fact those who knew best what's happening, because they were unable to tell. There is so much crisis in the air. The three main regions of the world are all facing a moment of maximum crisis. Europe, Asia, and the greater Middle East. Look at Europe, revanchist Russia, to be sure, but also revisionist Turkey, a delusional UK, a dysfunctional set of EU institutions, NATO astray, Germany a bit unreliable, the French illusory, as always. Okay? Look at Asia. So much unsettled history in Asia. No geography, with 5 nuclear powers in there. Economic pressures. China, Asia is closer to the condition of Europe at the start of the 20th century than it is in mid-century Europe. And finally, and I will not touch upon my 3 themes because I know I'm running out of time, look at the Middle East. This is no longer a promised land. The only thing it promises is trouble. It's never been as unstable as it is now, as volatile as it is now. It is the global Balkans of the 21st century. And frankly, I fear, in that context, which is that of a Sarajevo moment, that a war with Iran is brewing. Can happen anytime. Can happen anytime. And make no mistake, if a war with Iran erupts to the extent that, like in 1914, there's a predilection for several states for war over diplomacy, this is a war which can only end at the nuclear level.
You were talking about trends, and you were saying that it's not fair of me to say 2017, 2019, which is probably right, because it's too short of a trend. But when you're saying, I mean, this thesis of yours is not new, that there's still stability in the Euro-Atlantic axis. But if we look at the Middle East, you were talking about this, isn't there another trend? Isn't there this trend that in 2011, these people were like trying to get democracy, the Arab Spring, they were using Facebook, they were using our television, they were using our clothes for a couple of months or years. And now you see that some of the countries are relying on Russia and saying, Europe will not help us. And the other countries are relying on China. I mean, you have Chinese drones by the United Arab Emirates bombing cities in Libya today, which is something totally new.
Russia can help win a war. It cannot help win a peace. What the hell can Russia do when it comes to the reconstruction of Syria? It can only turn to the United States, to the West, to other states, and say, hey, will you chip in a little bit? If you give Russia the Sahara, they will run out of sand within a very short period of time. So 2011 was simply a misreading.
And what about China investing?
Arab trend. And look at China's attempt to use soft power in Africa, in Latin America. It is not working. It is just not working. It is a business transaction which is based on a moment of extreme affluence. And it seems to me that if, and I'll take 60 seconds and shut up, if indeed you have to look still for an access of stability in this kind of unreliable, existential, critical moment, you still turn to the Western axis. This is not a post-Western world. It is a de-Westernizing world. This is not a post-American order. It is an under-Americanized order. This is different. And the main relationship, the only viable and credible G2 at this time, does not involve Russia, does not involve China, does not involve the other new influentials. It is still related, however you define it, to the relationship between the United States and the EU, or Europe as and beyond its union. I'm depressed over the new map that speak of EU +1 or NATO -1, and attempt to reconstruct those institutions along those lines. I do think of the Euro-Atlantic community, US-EU at 35, which have been nurtured over the past 70 years, around which you can help stabilize those issues, notwithstanding the fact that no single state and no single group of states can alone attend and manage any one of the most significant issues on the world scene. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And now we have talked about Russia first, then about China, about the Middle East, and I would like to come a little bit more to the region, to the Baltic Sea region, to the Northern Europe region, although this is of course connected to everything. And I just heard just yesterday, and this I think it might be a good example, 2 US B-52 strategic bombers were lifting up in the United States, and they were on their way to Great Britain. But they took not really a shortcut by going to the Baltic Sea and flying to 150 kilometers close to Kaliningrad, only to say hello. And then flying back over Denmark to the United Kingdom, and were landing there, and they are there right now. Today, 1 day later, Russia, coincidentally or not, announced that starting in 4 days, there will be nuclear-capable ballistic missile tests of the Topol-M in the Arctic region. They will come up from near Murmansk area and then go to almost the North Pole, and then hopefully crash without causing any damage, but to the fish. And aren't these two things of the Arctic area and the Baltic Sea area being what seems more than ever an important playground for global powers? Aren't exactly these examples connecting these regional and, well, the panel said historic, I would say global aspects of power plays?
Thank you very much, and I will try to do my best to connect my thoughts and dig down to Northern Europe, Baltic Sea region, and the Arctic when it comes to these questions. First, I just want to say thank you for the invitation to the conference. It's great to be back here in Riga, and I will give 3 major reflections or points. One concerns the overall power shifts in world politics, and that they have been ongoing for more than a decade. So this is not about Trump's latest tweets. It's much bigger than that. And then I will look into who matters of these new powers for this region, who shapes both history and the regions from this perspective. And I will argue that it's China, Russia, and I would like to add a new power, which is the EU, and compare these 3 when it comes to what's shaping this region. And I think there we need to look at that this region now is the very center for strategic competition and arising from these power shifts that we see. And I would argue that we are not really prepared for that yet. Coming back to what could be the effects. So if we look at the global power shifts, these have been going on for a decade along 3 dimensions as I see it. One is the power shifts between states, as we have heard here. The hegemon, the United States, losing its ground to rivals. And the second power shift, I would say, goes from states to non-state actors. And that's not only groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, but also megacities and large corporations that to some extent can affect order, partly through institutions and other institutional frameworks. And the third shift, as also has been mentioned, is a shift of values that have global appeal. And it started around the global financial crisis. You could see that democracy was moving backwards as an idea of big appeal. And now we have added on lately also protectionism. So the idea of free markets and liberal and free trade is also losing ground. So I think I add that to this third dimension of power shifts that we have to relate to. And these are, as have been said here, systemic shifts. So secondly then, which new powers matters the most? I think it was mentioned here, India, Turkey, you can go on and mention a range of regional powers, but there are a few of them that stick out. I think these are still rivals, but on too small a scale in order to actually affect the order. China and Russia, they are not new powers. I mean, they're very old powers. But they are revisionists in their states. And to my mind, while China is looking forward, and actually I think China has this 30-year perspective, as Professor Serfaty was pointing out, and is on the rise, Russia is much more nostalgic in its approach. And I would say and argue also in decline. So a bit more on each of those. China, recognized now as a strategic rival, both by the US and lately actually also by the EU, surpassed the US in 2013 and became the largest GDP in purchasing power parity terms. So now it's not a question of whether, but when China will be the biggest economy also in nominal terms. Militarily, according to the military balance by IISS, the US is the largest defense spender, and then comes China when it comes to states. In between there is actually NATO Europe, which is also interesting. But China is pushing there. And you can also see a cultural outreach from China, the Confucius Institutes, TV channels, more and more active diplomacy in order to spread the Chinese view and posture on things. Hong Kong, I think, is the latest one we can relate to. China has a strategy to become a leading power globally by 2050. And this has been laid out pretty clearly, although the contours of that are still a bit vague. So on Russia then, that's another story. Russia, I think on this nostalgic terms, President Putin calling the fall of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe, and also more lately that if he could reverse Russian history, the Soviet Union would come back. So this is a different approach of a revisionist state. Russia very offended by President Barack Obama, calling Russia a regional power, using the nuclear weapons arsenal to punch above its weight, exercises, and so on, keeping all of those, keeping the largest stock actually globally, larger than the US if you compare both combined deployed and stored. So that's an economy, while its economy is the size of Spain. So that's a huge difference, number 4 on military spending in the world. And then if I introduce the EU as a new power, I think that's yet another story, very different, since it's not an old power, but postmodern, supranational body. I would like to see it's like an experiment of statecraft that has been going on for 60 years now, and it's still forming, but it is the second largest economy in the world. It's the largest foreign investor, it's largest on foreign aid, and as I mentioned also, if you add the military resources, even though the punch is not there, it's still a big sum when it comes to military resources. So it's strong on values, but weak on power projection. And I think what we have heard now from Ursula von der Leyen leading the new commission and setting the ambition of becoming a geopolitical entity, that's really a change of DNA for the EU, and it remains to be seen how we can manage such a transformation, I think. So thirdly, that now leads me to this region. I think I don't need to elaborate on how Russia acts in the region. Lots of experts and a lot of wise things have been said both in this panel and the last panel on this. the negative effects of Russia's assertive behavior, how it influences the region, what will happen in Belarus, and so on. But I think a more profound question for the region, it was also raised in the previous panel, is for all of the rest of us here, is who balances Russia? That's actually core. I'm from Sweden. We used to balance Russia in the great old days from when we were the great power up here. Then we withdrew from that position in the early 19th century. We didn't have the power to do it anymore. United Kingdom, Great Britain came in. We had Germany for some time. And then since World War II, the United States has held that position. And it's still the first question we actually ask when there is a crisis, or, you know, and it was, the question was asked again, will Germany come, you know? But that's a question we really need to think about. And when will that power come to our help here? The EU, I want to say a few words on, because I think the EU established itself here after the Cold War, basically. Before, I mean, Sweden and Finland joined in '95, and then we had the Baltic states join in Poland. Denmark was a member before, and Germany, of course, but Norway and Iceland are still outside, but close to us. So the EU, in a way, we are the EU to some extent. The EU affects this region from within, with its values, the democracy, market, you know, liberal economy, free trade, human rights, rule of law, the institutional world. And that's very important for us as mainly small states here. And we need to recognize this contested environment much more and use the EU. In these, you know, we talk a lot about NATO, but I really want to lift up the EU as the fundament also for this region. And then news to the region is China. China is far away from us geographically, historically, not at all as Russia. Russia is integrated into this region. But defining itself as a near-Arctic state since 2018, I think that's very interesting. It has not yet defined itself as a near-Baltic state, but you know, who knows if that's the next line. It wouldn't feel too strange. So we have seen in this past years, China actually, we are not coming to China. We are coming to China, but China is also coming a lot to us. And when it comes to the Arctic, I think that's really a signal of that great power competition has entered the Arctic, and that this era of Arctic exceptionalism, as we have talked about, where the Arctic was like a safe haven for cooperation, that area is past now. We have the militarization, of course, of the Russia, as you mentioned, the tests. I think it's good that they are announcing it, actually. That's a sign of transparency. The B-52s, I think they brought here partly in order to be able to conduct surveillance over the Arctic, actually. So it's a support from the US to this region through Great Britain. And China now scanning the Arctic, as they do with the Baltic Sea, for business opportunities, investing heavily in research, which is connected to climate change effects. So looking for when do sea roads open up, when can we, what will happen to the natural resources up there. And then China is also heavily investing here. It's not the prime area, Baltic Sea region, but it's here for harbors, for tunnels, for roads and all these kinds of projects. And the Belt and Road Initiative, the 7+1 initiative and so on. So China is integrating here. And I want to end up saying that I think we need to understand China, as was said, securing its machinery through also this region, its global outreach, like the empires have done all the time, as Great Britain did, the US and so on. So they are here to stay, and we have to relate to that. I think we are not up to the task yet of having a joint strategy strong enough to deal with this contested environment as we are navigating in now. Thank you.
Two more questions on China. First, you said Russia and China are revisionist. And I'm asking, that's the first question, is China really revisionist? Because they never made a secret out of staying 100% communist. Instead, they developed some sort of new authoritarian regime where people can have wealth, where people can travel, just recently we had 70 years of China, and in front of the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin there were so many Chinese flags. And I first thought it was a demonstration, but it was only tourists. There was many, many Chinese tourists getting out their Chinese flags and then demonstrating or just Instagramming. Oh no, Instagram is forbidden. But something else, back to China. So the question is it really revisionist or is this something new? And the second question is, you said, the question is who is balancing Russia in this Baltic Sea region? And my question is, what is China's role here? Are they balancing Russia, or are they coming on Russia's side of the whip, or is this a third model which suddenly is between the EU and Russia and tries to jump on this construction?
Thank you. I think when I say that China, I view China as revisionist, it's about their role in the world, in the global scene. So if you tell Chinese people, the rise of China, they would react and say, we're re-establishing China as a global actor, power. You could say it was only regional before, but most powers were regional if you look far back. But it's about their place in the system. And that's also for Russia. I agree with you that they have a bit more of a new narrative since the People's Republic of China is just 70 years old. So in that sense, it's new, it's forward-leaning, it goes step by step, building its economy, building its muscles, entering the new phase. And that's the narrative of China, and set the goal of 2050. That's the end of this expansionist period that they have entered now. And then they will have reached again, as they think of it, their global leadership role or leader role.
What about their role in the region? Who are they balancing? Are they balancing anyone?
In the region?
In the Baltic Sea region. Because
oh yes, and the second question, I think that's interesting. I think it's really a bit up to grab. I think it's part of a multipolar game that we see now, and there are lots of speculations about that. Will Russia and China align, or will U.S. and Russia align, or how will this balance act play out? And I don't have any answers of that. I think we need to recognize that China is here much more, and I think they are here to stay, and that we have to navigate from.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to open the panel to the audience, or the audience to the panel. Again, we have more activity on the left side, but I would say we start. Where are the microphones? Are there any microphones? Oh, yeah, just to your neighbor, please. Or do you also want to talk? No. We start there and we take 3 questions and then we let the panel answer.
Karthik Desai, Chairman of the Board, Institute of Quantum Mechanics and Strategic Studies, and SIA Baltovens. First of all, I would like to make a comment and then a question. Being born in a family of a person who wrote Constitution of India, and also had an opportunity to have close interactions over a long period of time with Chairman Deng Xiaoping, the architect of modern China. What I have observed is that whenever these countries don't have a policy paralysis, they have progressed. When there is a prompt implementation of a policy, they have progressed. China being a single party, and India now having an absolute majority. The people of India voted for an absolute majority for a government. Here in EU, what I have observed, that most of the countries, they don't have absolute majority for a single party or a single ideology. So there is a lot of policy paralysis. There are a lot of, tug of war, conflict of ideologies, interests. So there are policy paralysis on several fronts. Even if you say, even among the NATO members, like US and EU, TTIP is put on hold. India and China, they have differences, but they have not let their economic interest come in the way. They have close economic cooperations, whether it is BRICS or Shanghai Cooperation, SCO, or even the BRICS Bank, or ADB. So, and secondly, another observation that the people in China and India, yeah, sure.
Yeah,
so, yeah, okay. Sure. People in India and China, they have been working on an average 60 hours a week, whereas in Europe, it's less, 40 hours a week. So, in order to progress, so do you think the political parties in Europe, will come to a common agenda, common conclusion with a nationalistic or a patriotic approach towards European Union as a whole. What are your comments?
Okay, thank you very much. I think there was someone, yeah, the lady in the middle, just in the middle. Could she get a microphone? Yeah, it comes from your left. Great.
Thank you. My name is Victoria Antonova. I'm a master's graduate in international studies from Aarhus University in Denmark. My question is to Brian. I was wondering about your comment about the 13th century documents that you're talking about. I don't want to dismiss the role of political culture, but I was just wondering what's the value of sort of this type of analysis, because if you look at most countries at that time, they were probably not exactly beacons of democracy either. And there's no really continuation necessarily. If you look at Putin's regime, there's sort of cherry picking of orthodox, imperialist, Soviet elements. And maybe your systemic approach is good for dealing with the Kremlin, but what about those outside of the system? Don't you think that this kind of political fatalism is a bit unfair and unhelpful for dealing with opposition in Russia? So to rephrase, I guess, what are the implications of your analysis for dealing with those in the system and outside of it? And am I understanding you correctly that authoritarianism is sort of a destiny for Russia?
Thank you. Another very good question. Third one, to your right. I don't know who it is, man or woman, but someone's raising his hand. So,
man, not a woman.
Great.
Vilmars Vītoliņš, master's graduate of University of Latvia. I had a question to Mr. Whitmore, but if anyone else wants to pick it up, feel free. When talking about shaping regions or history, you mentioned the symbolic role of Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. I would like to ask, in your opinion, what should be the transatlantic policy towards Belarus, and which countries should shape this policy or organizations?
Okay, thank you very much. I think the first question was most provocative, but very reasonable from a certain point of view. If we have powers which are have a majority governments, which are ideologically strengthened and absolutely fit, does this mean that the European Union does also need to be more than just more integrated, but pulling on a common rope? I mean, working together as one entity, as we heard, ideologic entity? Professor?
You've got to remember history. You should not imagine it. The fact of the matter is that the making of the European Union was never a matter of choice. It was always a matter of necessity. So that if you want to speak to me about the unraveling of the European Union, you have to explain to me how, when, and whether this necessity is now gone. When in the world was there a party majority in most of the European countries who signed the Rome treaties, or who signed the Maastricht Treaty, or who signed the launch of the EU, there was always an objection to it, which was overcome because there was no alternative to it. And if anything was needed to make the case for the indispensability of thinking Europe as a union, Brexit just made it. Because it is quite clear that this long delayed withdrawal on the part of the United Kingdom is so very difficult to achieve. Europe has been built since 1956, one crisis at a time. Set back and move forward. The French had a phrase for it, relance européenne. Now, it may well be that this time it will not occur, but what in the world gives you the evidence to make that statement? The reference to political parties being divided comes back like the seasons. You have them periodically. The case I was making about Asia is that unlike Europe, Asia has not resolved its history. Just consider the relationship between China, South Korea, North Korea, and Japan. You speak of India and China engaged into economic cooperation. What nonsense, with all due respect. These two states are adversarial. There's nothing India wants which China acknowledges, like a seat at the United Nations, for example, in the Security Council. Nothing China seeks that India acknowledges. There are two major nuclear weapons. Nearby you have Pakistan, a strike-first proponent. There's also North Korea. There are 5 nuclear powers there, in 2 cases led by radical governments. I'm not comfortable with the condition of Asia, and I think we overstate the need for China to become the superpower it is bound to be, but not quite yet. It is hard work. It takes time. And telling otherwise is not going to accelerate the clock. My fear is that China is trying to do too much too quickly now because it feels the pressure of time. That's what I fear. I don't fear China being a superpower. I fear China becoming a superpower.
Yeah.
Brian, me, I'll shut up from now on.
No. I thought you were finished. Brian, in your systematic approach, did you forget the Russian opposition?
No, I didn't. And I think the questioner may have misunderstood my comments. I was not talking about 13th century documents, but a monograph about 15th century Russia, which incidentally was written in 1986 by a Harvard historian. And yes, you're correct. Other parts of Europe were not terribly democratic at that time. No place was terribly democratic at that time. The difference is other parts of Europe changed and developed institutions, and Russia did not. So I think I would not say that authoritarianism is Russia's destiny, but it is its default setting. And it's very difficult to change this. We've seen this movie too many times. And when we're dealing and talking about Western security, we have to deal with the Russia we have, not the Russia we wish we had. I would be very happy to see democratic change in Russia. No, I'm not forgetting about the opposition. I know the opposition exists. I'm watching what's happening right now with a lot of interest. But when I talk about the Russian sistema, I'm talking about the essence of how things are done. I'm talking about that that institutions are hollow. They're fictions. You have a parliament in Russia, but it doesn't do what a parliament in Denmark or Sweden or the United States does. It doesn't really deliberate and pass laws that are not already decided on in behind closed doors elsewhere. It's a facade to mask the true nature of oligarchic rule. When you sign a contract in the West, it's sacred, it's sacrosanct. You know it's enforceable in a court of law. When you sign a contract in Russia, and believe me, I've been foolish enough to sign contracts in Russia, it is enforceable to the extent that you have a krisha, a roof, a cover, protection, that is stronger than the other party's krisha, right? This is how it works. It's a system where might makes right. This is I think, the best illustration of the lack of institutions. That has not changed since the 15th century. It hasn't. And that's what we're dealing with. So when I talk of this systemic conflict, I'm talking about societies where institutions are real and matter, and a society where institutions exist only in this hollow form, and they're fictions masking a system that's based on corrupt contacts and networks. To the question on Belarus, I guess I should just go right there. Yeah. My answer is very simple: keep it independent. And this puts the West in a very, very, very difficult spot right now. It's no secret to anybody that watches and follows this part of the world as obsessively as I do that Russia is beginning to become unhappy with its informal arrangements with Mr. Lukashenko, not to mention their formal arrangements. Putin and Lukashenko don't like each other, personally, and they look at this relationship in a very different way. Russia's always looked at it as an imperial relationship. Lukashenko has always looked at it as a transactional relationship. You pay me and I'll be your ally. Putin wants to do away with that arrangement right now and would like to turn Belarus into a de facto extension of Russia's Western military district, which would bring Russian military power right up to the border of NATO members Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. This must not happen. But this puts us in a very, very, very difficult spot. Because right now, the guarantor of Belarusian independence is one Alexander Lukashenko, who will never be an ally of the West. Right? So this puts us in a very difficult spot. And the Belarusian opposition has also come to this conclusion. They will never like Lukashenko, but right now he is the best guarantee of Belarus's independence. And because the minute he goes, he will be replaced, I'm certain, with a pro-Moscow KGB general. And then who will, after which will invite Russia to build that air base that they've been wanting to build since 2015 that Lukashenko's not allowing them to build. So this puts the West in a very difficult position, but what the West needs to do is protect Belarus's independence one way or the other. That's what's in the West's interest right now.
Yeah. Anna, maybe we could continue talking a little bit about Belarus in the Baltic Sea region, because when I was studying in Sweden in 2006, I analyzed a project, an Interreg project, which had 2 regions in Belarus in it. And in this time, really, the EU tried so many things, put funding into Belarus to bring it more to the Baltic Sea region. And we had many maps at this time showing Belarus as a Baltic Sea country in one way or another. This is 13 years ago. Would you still say it is part or should be part of the region here, or is it because of global power struggles and especially from Russia, as we heard, is it moving away from the region?
Well, of course, geographically, it is where it is. So if you look at the map, Belarus would be there. But I think that the hopes we might have had on some kind of democratic development, they have not been fulfilled. I still think there are civil society contacts, which are important, people-to-people contacts. But I think we all understand Lukashenko now as, I mean, he's close to Russia, but he wants the sovereignty of Belarus to the largest extent possible, while Russia is signaling that, okay, you get that, but at a certain point you will not have it anymore. And I think that was what we have to look at also from a security perspective here. I know Lithuania is very concerned, for instance, about the hybrid specters of that kind of gray zone scenario you could see.
Is this a chance also for the region, for the neighboring countries, and I'm talking of Lithuania, for example, and Poland, to get Belarus back into Europe? Question to you?
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, if I may, I mean, it's tricky. I mean, I've had these discussions in Poland and in Lithuania, and it is tricky. Lukashenko's never going to be our friend. And I think the first order of business has to be security here. We're talking about the security of 3 of our NATO allies right here. We're talking about Russian power being brought right up to their borders. And I think that has to be prevented. And that means at the moment, it means dealing with a very unsavory character who let's face it, will never be a friend or a partner of the West. But he has prevented Russia from building that air base that Russia wants in Belarus. He has made it clear that he does not want his territory to be used by Russia for an attack on a third party, whether it be Ukraine or a NATO member. He does not want to be in the middle of he's not interested in a conflict with the West. So this, again, puts us in this really, really tricky situation. The best scenario I could see that we can get out of this is Cold War era Romania, which was a big pain in the butt for the Soviet Union, never allowed Soviet troops in its territory, was never a friend of the West. Ceausescu was never a friend of the West, let's be clear. But he was, and that's what we can hope for right now with Belarus. But there is not an easy answer to this question.
May I jump in? Did I hear you say that Russia can never be our friend?
I said Belarus can.
Oh, Belarus. Okay, forgive me.
Lukashenko can never be our friend. Belarus is Lukashenko can never be our friend.
The current. Okay. As you can see, we are touching upon many aspects while talking new powers, emerging autocratic regimes, shaping regions and shaping history. I just want you to remind that this is the overall topic, because we are going so much into many details, which is absolutely fair. So we have one more round of questions, and well, who's first is first. So you were first. It was the gentleman on the left side. I saw you too. And the third, once again, your hands, please. No one else? Then it's so. He was first, sorry. So we start with you.
Okay, thank you. My name is Strahinja Subotic. I come from Serbia. I work at the European Policy Center as a researcher, and I have a question for Ms. Anna. You mentioned how the idea of having a geopolitical commission is changing EU's DNA, if I got it correctly. So I would like to ask you, this term, geopolitical, how much of it is just a theoretical idea that Ursula von der Leyen had, and is it actually implementable? We today heard that a lot of member states oppose the idea of European army, EU army, and we heard that the EU hasn't been really as active in the foreign policy as some people expected it to be. So my question is to you, what do you expect of the next Commission when it comes to geopolitics? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think you were the next.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Axel Hellman, and I'm a policy fellow at the European Leadership Network in London. My question is also for Anna Wieslander. Thank you for some really interesting remarks. And one of the things that you said that stood out to me was that the EU is strong on values, but it is weak on power projection. And my question is whether or not it still makes sense to maintain that distinction. You know, it's always good that European leaders can criticize other actors when they, you know, behave badly and stand up for European values. But if you can actually act on those values and project power in accordance with those values, then what kind of foreign policy actor are you?
Thank you. And we have the first question there, almost in the middle. Sorry. We're running out of time. This is the last one. No, up. Sorry. It was the gentleman to your front. Sorry. Thank you very much.
Yeah, good afternoon. Nico Segers from Belgium, representing the Youth Atlantic Treaty Association here. My question would be for Mrs. Wieslander, and with regards to the time setting, as you indicated that China is actually really, I mean, in my opinion as well, running very hard and playing out the competition card very hardly towards the West. I think I'm in the future that we'll see side effects such as more Chinese lawfare, in fact, so that trying to bend the rules to their wishes, as you know, the EU is a big producer of legislation, and I don't know if China has that patience to actually by 2050 to actually wait for EU legislation to move on to let's say vis-a-vis their strategic interests. And then again, I was thinking about, isn't China in a way forcing Europeans to rethink their model of open economic an open economic template, but forcing our hand maybe into eventual more protectionism with regards to, say, strategic assets, as we all, know there are lots of analysis going around with regards to China potentially siphoning away strategic R&D and gaining access to our EU digital infrastructure. So that would be my question to Mrs. Wieslander.
Thank you very much. Anna, I think the first one was on the Commission on Geopolitics, or how will the foreign policy of the next Commission look like, and how should it look like? The second one was power and values. Can you really distinguish? And the third one is, will China's ambitions lead to new EU protectionism? So I hope you can answer all of them in 3 to 4 questions, minutes.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, really great questions. On the Geopolitical Commission, well, I mean, it's super interesting that this word is entering, I think, the narrative of the European Union, because it has been completely absent. If you look at the EU global strategy, it recognizes that we have a contested environment, but doesn't really draw any conclusions from that. So this is something else. I don't have any high hopes on that sense. I think it will be enough just to start relating discussions within the EU to this kind of new concept. I hope, it relates to the next question actually, you know, what are the EU's interests? Can we start talking about that a bit more and not only about values? Because first you define your interests, and then you define a strategy how to guard or you know, reach those interests, and then you start pushing. You need to use your assets in order to get that. I mean, everyone who has been meeting the United States in any kind of negotiation, I think, has that kind of realization that, oh, we're meeting, you know, someone who wants something and who has the muscles and the influence to get it. And if the European Union has an ambition on that level, which I think could be a good thing, then the mindset and the processes need to change. And of course, it's not big one country, it's several countries. That's a big challenge. So yes, I think that values and power projection, I think it's about self-esteem to some extent, self-confidence in what are the assets of the European Union. Strong on trade, I would say, and also connecting perhaps to the third question, big internal market, free trade market, that's a huge asset. The US has always kept that as a very big asset to itself. It's a big market. We also have a great market for ourselves. Would the increased protectionism? I think it's possible. I think that discussion will really be something that we will look into, because it becomes so uneven to have a very open market for everyone else. And if we look at it as our home market, a joint home market, the perspectives might become a bit different.
Okay, thank you. Okay, in this case, I would like to ask the last question to the whole panel. We have heard today that there are new, maybe not new, maybe old, maybe revisionist powers which are rising, which are getting more important on a global scale just because of globalism and because they have their intentions. They're shaping not only their regions. I think we can agree all on this, that they are shaping more than their regions, or at least trying to shape this. And my question would be, when we see that most of these powers, not all, but most of these are authoritarian regimes, and they seem to bring another values, another ideologies into the global sphere. Is being a democracy in this context a strength, or is it a weakness? Because it seems like we are talking for years now about the same subjects. They're coming, they're coming, they're coming, and they're still coming. And we are more, yes, academically talking about it, but not really. It seems not really acting, or can we act at all? So, question is are we as democracies strong enough to sort of counter or at least face these new authoritarian regimes rising? And 2 minutes each.
I would say yes, we are strong enough, but we have to remember what we are. Last week I was shocked to see, I don't know if anybody followed this scandal between the NBA, the National Basketball Association, and the People's Republic of China, but I never thought I would see in my lifetime the Communist Party of China able to restrict the free speech of a United States citizen. But that's precisely what I just saw happen in my country last week. We have to remember who we are. We have to remember who the we is in this situation. We are not defined by race, by ethnicity, by religion, by region. We're defined that we agree to live in societies governed by law. And we have to get back to that and rediscover that. And we will not be strong enough to face this onslaught from authoritarian countries until we remember who we are and what defines we. So that's my very brief response to that.
Anna.
Thank you. It's a great question, and I must continue to say that, you know, I refuse to believe that authoritarianism is a better way of doing things than democracy. I mean, that it's just that we have not been able to. I don't know if we are using. I think there are weaknesses in these kind of systems that we are not using. We are all the time talking about the strength of Russia, the strength of China, you know, reacting, and we have to be more resilient ourselves, which is a great point. But at the same time, I wonder, are we exploring the weaknesses of these systems enough? I'm not sure we are. I think that we can do much more because they are not peaking yet in their power. One is on, going down, one is perhaps going up. But this, it's not, they don't have the perfect system and the perfect answer. And I'm not sure that we are responding to it enough. I think we have a great system offer. I think we should guard it within our own, of course, but we could also do more externally. And one thing the last thing I would say is that I'm also wondering, do we take the cost for it enough? I think there is a price we're perhaps not paying sometimes. We move into a trap of being more transactional. We think this is a win-lose, and it is perhaps more of a world. But anyone can pitch in more and get more. You pay the price for that cost. You can reach for, you can try to reach for systemic leadership. Great Britain have done it. The United States did it pretty young. And they managed. And why couldn't we, ideally, US and Europe together, do that more? Yeah. But we're not yet willing to take the costs.
Thank you. Professor Serfaty.
I share my colleagues' conclusions. We're not on the eve of any liberal hegemonic order. We're not on the eve. It may happen sometime in the future, but surely not yet. That would be rushing to conclusions, it seems to me, without testing the resiliency of the new influentials or renewed influentials. Okay. The new and renewed influentials, to go back to an earlier question, seem to me to be living their future in the past tense still. To that extent, they are all revisionists. Russia is still struggling with their most recent defeat in 1989, 1991, and wants to reverse that. Iran is still haunted by the memories of 1953, in which the revolution of 1979 was not enough to reverse. Turkey wants to change the territorial sale of its empire that took place between 1916 and 1924. Any one of those ascending states, which I think about, have a point of departure which is deep in the past. The liberal hegemonic order did not force its participants to become somebody or something else. It forced its participants to become somebody or something more. That's what was meant by joining the institutional order, that the United States and the states of Europe built one crisis at a time, one complaint of decline at the time, one warning of ascending and challenging power at the time. And that's where we are now. That's why I still say, Julian, don't rush to conclusions. You may well be right in due time, but Keynes had it all wrong. In the long run, we will be fine. I'm worried about the short term and want to remain alive in the short term.
Maybe the best conclusion ever, to not rush to conclusions. Thank you for the questions of the audience, and let me together thank the panels. Thank you.